The history we all know seems carved in stone. The War of 1812 was an epic confrontation between two giants, Emperor Alexander I and Napoleon Bonaparte. France's Grand Army, having conquered all of Europe, invades the vast expanses of the Russian Empire. A heroic defense, a scorched Moscow, the Battle of Borodino, and finally the disgraceful retreat and destruction of the French troops in a frozen wasteland. This picture is familiar to everyone from their school days. It forms the foundation of our national identity, celebrated in novels and captured in magnificent paintings. We don't question it because it seems obvious and the only correct version. But what if for a moment we set aside the familiar textbooks and look at Napoleon's own documents, his letters and orders? It is there, in the primary sources, that a real mystery begins. In them, you will hardly find the word Russia that we are accustomed to. Instead, the French emperor writes about a campaign into a mysterious Tartary, about the lands of ancient Muscovy, about clashes with some kind of Asiatic hordes. It sounds like a description of a journey to a completely different, almost mythical country, not a military report on a campaign against a well-known European power. Imagine the bewilderment of a historian who discovers that a key participant in the events calls his opponent by a completely different name than the one we use today. This isn't just a stylistic quirk or a nod to archaic geography. It's a fundamental discrepancy that calls into question everything we know. If Napoleon was convinced he was fighting Tartary, then what was the Russian Empire of Alexander I in his eyes? Was it an ally, a bystander, or something else entirely? This strangeness forces us to ask the main, almost seditious question. What if our real enemy in that war was not who we are told it was? It's possible that Napoleon was not marching against the Russian Empire we know, but against another powerful state that was later simply erased from political maps and wiped from the pages of history. Perhaps the familiar narrative of the War of 1812 is just a convenient screen hiding a much more complex and grandiose drama, the true story of a civilization we lost. The answers to these questions are hidden not in rewritten chronicles, but in the silent witnesses of that era, in the artifacts that have survived to our days and hold the key to unraveling this great mystery. And the first such key is an old medal that is completely inexplicable from the point of view of official history. To avoid making baseless claims, let's start our investigation with one specific tangible object that anyone can find on the website of the Russian State Library. In 1912, the entire empire lavishly celebrated the centenary of the victory in the Patriotic War. It was a time of patriotic fervor, the erection of monuments, and the release of numerous commemorative artifacts designed to forever fix the great feat of their ancestors in the national memory. And here, among these solemn exhibits, we find one absolutely incredible item, a commemorative medal, or as it's called, a plaque. On its front side, the profiles of two emperors are minted, Alexander I and Napoleon Bonaparte. But look at how they are depicted. They are not opposing each other as mortal enemies in a decisive battle. No, they look at each other calmly, with dignity, almost like equal allies or partners engaged in an important dialogue. There is not a hint of hatred or contempt in their images that should accompany the depiction of an aggressor and his victim. This is a scene of mutual respect between two great rulers of their era. This image alone is slightly bewildering, but turn the medal over, and bewilderment gives way to genuine shock. On the reverse side is an inscription that completely overturns our understanding of that war. It reads, "In unity there is strength," and further, "The providence of God, the firmness of the monarch, love for the motherland and the people." Let's pause for a moment and think about this. In unity there is strength. This phrase is placed on a commemorative token dedicated to a war described to us as the most bloody clash of civilizations. Unity with whom? With the very man whose army, according to the official version, brought untold disasters and burned the ancient capital. How can a symbol of unity be placed next to the portraits of two emperors who we are assured were mortal enemies? This isn't just an oddity, it's a logical paradox. Imagine if, in honor of the end of another great war, a medal was issued with the image of two opposing leaders and the motto, "Together we are strong." It seems absurd, unthinkable. Commemorative signs are created to reinforce a certain version of events, not to contradict it. This medal doesn't just contradict, it screams that the official history is, to put it mildly, incomplete. It seems to hint at some kind of alliance, a common goal that united the two monarchs. But what goal and against whom, then, was this unity directed? One could dismiss this as the whim of a medalist or some symbol of post-war reconciliation. But the motto speaks not of reconciliation after hostility, but of a strength that is born precisely in unity. This implies a joint action, not forgiveness. This artifact is not just a souvenir. It is an official product issued for the centenary anniversary and therefore approved at the highest level. And it presents us with a choice. Either our ancestors 100 years ago had absolutely no understanding of the events they were celebrating, or we today are missing something very important. Perhaps this medal is just a coincidence, a strange anomaly, a single case that proves nothing. But what if it's not? What if this is just the first clue sticking out from under a thick layer of rewritten history? What if there are many more artifacts that call the official version into question? The suspicion that the medal with the motto about unity is not a random anomaly finds powerful confirmation as soon as one delves deeper into the archives. If we turn to an old book called Monuments and Medals in Memory of the Combat Feats of the Russian Army, we will find a whole section dedicated to the centenary of the war. And there, among the descriptions of dozens of award badges, we find even more astonishing examples that completely shatter the familiar picture of the world. Here, for example, is medal number 7. On its obverse is the profile of Napoleon in his famous bicorn hat and uniform. And on the reverse, an image of the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, the main symbol of gratitude for the deliverance from the invasion, with the inscription Moscow and the dates 1812-1912. Think about it. On one side of the medal is the face of the man considered the cause of the city's destruction, and on the other, the cathedral built in honor of the victory over him. It's like putting a portrait of a firefighter and an arsonist on the same coin. The logic here is completely absent, unless we are missing some important detail that connects these two images. But that's not all. The description of medal number 9 adds even more mysteries. On the obverse, again, is the profile of Napoleon turned to the right, and next to it, the inscription Napoleon Rex. And here lies an incredible detail. All the letters in the inscription are Latin except for one, a distinct Russian letter R. On the reverse, the concise phrase, in memory, a star, and the dates 1812-1912. Why was this strange mix of alphabets necessary? It cannot be a mistake by the engraver on an official commemorative token. It is a clear sign, a deliberate emphasis that must have been understood by contemporaries. What did it mean? The question is no longer about one strange medal. We are seeing a whole series of official commemorative tokens issued in the Russian Empire, on which the Emperor of France is depicted not as a defeated enemy, but as a central heroic figure worthy of memory and respect. Why would Russia, in the Russian language, mint medals in honor of a man who, according to the official legend, was the Antichrist, the Corsican monster, and the greatest enemy of the fatherland? Commemorative tokens are created to glorify one's own heroes and immortalize one's own victories. Here we see the glorification of the leader of the enemy army. And this paradox extends far beyond numismatics. If we turn to the literature and memoirs of the 19th century, to the poems of Pushkin, Lermontov, and the diaries of participants in those events, we will find another discovery. The image of Napoleon is not demonized there at all. In these texts, you will find almost no traces of burning hatred or contempt for the French emperor. On the contrary, through the lines, one can feel respect for his genius, admiration for the scale of his personality, and recognition of his historical role. He is perceived not as a barbarian destroyer, but as a tragic, grandiose figure of world scale. One gets the impression that someone later, already in the 20th century, deliberately rewrote history, simplifying it to a primitive US versus them scheme, turning the real and complex Napoleon into a convenient symbol of an absolute enemy necessary for a new ideological worldview. But if his contemporaries did not see him as a monster, if medals were minted in his honor, if his image on commemorative tokens was juxtaposed with symbols of unity, then the entire official history of the war begins to fall apart. And the main question that arises from this contradiction is, if they were not irreconcilable enemies, but maintained complex yet quite respectful relations, then who gave the order to burn Moscow? and against whom was the United Army of Europe, which entered the borders of the mysterious Muscovy, actually fighting? Perhaps the answer lies not only in official symbols, but also in the personal belongings that connected the two emperors and their generals. If official awards cast from cold metal can lie, or at least not tell the whole story, then perhaps the truth should be sought in more personal items, in objects that hold the warmth of their owner's hands. And such witnesses exist. To find them, we need to go back to 1912, to that same grandiose exhibition in Moscow dedicated to the centenary of the war. Fortunately, a detailed catalog of it has survived. The brief overview of the exhibition thoroughly describes the exhibits presented in each hall, and reading this document can capture the imagination more than any fiction. Let's mentally transport ourselves to the halls, dedicated to the events of 1813 to 1815. That is the period after the expulsion of the Grand Army. On the middle shelf of one of the stands, as the catalog dispassionately informs us, lay a completely incredible exhibit. It was Napoleon Bonaparte's personal saber, but the most striking thing is not the fact of its existence, but to whom it was given. The saber was received not by just anyone, but by Count Pavel Andreevich Shuvalov, a Russian general, a hero of the War of 1812. But how and why did the personal weapon of the Emperor of France end up with a Russian general? Perhaps it was a trophy taken in battle. The catalog provides an exhaustive and stunning answer. The description specifies that it was General Shuvalov who accompanied Napoleon to his first exile on the island of Elba. Stop and realize the full depth of this fact. A Russian general who had just participated in a war against France does not simply escort a defeated enemy, but accompanies him. And as a token of gratitude for this accompaniment, Napoleon gives him his personal saber. A weapon for a military leader of that era is not just a tool. It is a symbol of his honor, his power, his soul. You don't give such a gift to your jailer. You give such a gift to an equal, a person you trust, whom you respect, to whom you are grateful for a service rendered with dignity. This gesture completely destroys the myth of irreconcilable enmity. This is a scenario in which one ally ensures the safety of another during a difficult stage of his journey. There is no other way to explain this gift. But if you think this is the most shocking detail from the exhibition catalog, you are mistaken. Nearby, another exhibit is mentioned that testifies not just to mutual respect, but to direct military cooperation. Samples of French army uniforms were transferred to the Museum of the War of 1812 from the Quartermaster's Museum, and the description states in black and white that these samples were personally offered by Napoleon to Alexander I for a more ceremonial appearance of the Russian army. In particular, an example of a Cossack uniform designed according to Napoleon's model is cited. This is direct and irrefutable proof. The leaders of two warring armies are discussing uniform design. The Emperor of France is helping his enemy make his army more beautiful and modern. This completely contradicts the common belief that the uniforms of the Russian and French armies were very different and were the main visual marker of friend or foe. On the contrary, according to this document, the uniforms were almost identical, designed with the participation of the same person. This indicates that the armies were possibly viewed not as opposing forces, but as different parts of a single whole that were supposed to look harmonious. A personal gift in the form of a saber and the joint development of military uniforms are no longer just strange artifacts. They are clues pointing to the existence of an alliance hidden behind the screen of an official war. If the emperors and their generals collaborated so closely, then what is hidden behind all these magnificent monuments of victory that are scattered throughout the country? If the war was just a performance, then who was actually defeated? Perhaps the answer is encrypted in these monuments themselves, in their most unexpected details. Personal belongings and uniforms could be hidden away in museum storerooms, but the evidence of the supposed alliance was in plain sight, cast in bronze and carved in granite. They stand in our cities and villages, and we walk past them, not even suspecting the secret code they contain. The most visually convincing part of our investigation is the monuments dedicated to that very war. The monuments that were supposed to be symbols of Russian victory are, in fact, decorated with the symbols of Napoleon's army. And this is not an isolated case, but a whole system covering the entire geography of the military operations. Let's start with the monument in the village of Tarutino, erected in 1834, on the spot where the Russian army under the command of Kutuzov fortified itself after leaving Moscow. At first glance, everything is solemn and patriotic. A column, a cross, inscriptions about the valor of the soldiers. But look up, and your attention is drawn to the figure of an eagle with outstretched wings crowning the monument. This is not the double-headed eagle, the ancient symbol of Byzantium and the Russian Empire. It is a single-headed eagle with its head turned to the left. It was precisely this eagle, the heir to the eagles of the Roman legions, that was the personal emblem of the Emperor of France and the main symbol of his grand army. It adorned the banners with which the French troops marched across Europe. So, why does a French eagle crown a monument dedicated to Russian troops? Perhaps a sculptor's mistake. But let's read the inscription on one side of the monument. On this spot, the Russian army, having fortified, saved Russia and Europe. Pay attention to the last part, and Europe. If the war was waged against a united Europe led by Napoleon, why state that the Russians saved and strengthened their enemy? The inscription and the symbol on this monument not only contradict each other, but together they create a new logic. The Russian army, acting under a common symbol with the Europeans, the eagle, fulfilled some common mission to save all of Europe. Think it's a coincidence? Then let's move to the Kaliningrad region, to the monument erected on the spot where the great commander Mikhail Andreas Barclay de Tolly passed away. The monument was erected by personal order of the Prussian king. And what do we see at its top? The very same single-headed French eagle. This is truly amazing, especially when you remember that the family coat of arms of Prince Barclay de Tolly himself depicts a double-headed Russian eagle. The creators of the monument could not have been unaware of this. They deliberately ignored the personal coat of arms of the Russian field marshal and placed the symbol of the army he supposedly fought his entire life on the monument. This oddity becomes a pattern when we look at other monuments. In the city of Kobarin in Belarus, there is a monument in honor of the first major victory of Russian troops in 1812. And again, an eagle at the top. But if you look closely, it holds a round laurel wreath in its beak. And it was precisely the eagle with a wreath that was a key element of the Napoleonic army's standards, a symbol of triumph. So, it turns out a monument to a Russian victory is adorned with a symbol of French triumph, or perhaps it was their common triumph. The culmination of this symbolic anomaly is the grandiose monument Grateful Russia to the Heroes of 1812 in Smolensk, erected for the centenary of the war. It was supposed to be the quintessential idea of Russia's impregnability, but at its top, on a rock, proudly sits the same single-headed eagle. Let's sum it up. The symbol of power in Russia, of its imperial succession from Byzantium, is the double-headed eagle. The symbol of Napoleon's empire, his succession from Rome, is the single-headed eagle. These are not just different birds. They are symbols of two different civilizational projects. Why then are dozens of monuments that are supposed to glorify Russia's victory over Napoleon decorated with the coat of arms of his own empire? This cannot be a series of mistakes made by different sculptors at different times and in different places. It is a clear, readable code that indicates that the line between us and them in that war was not as clear-cut as we are told. The majestic monuments cry out to us about an alliance that was later forgotten. But the most important and irrefutable proof of this alliance was hidden not in bronze, but on paper. It was waiting for its moment in an archive, written by the hand of Emperor Napoleon himself. We have examined metal, stone, and fabric, silent witnesses that hint at a great deception. We've seen medals celebrating the unity of enemies, a personal weapon given as a sign of respect, and Napoleon's imperial symbols crowning Russian monuments. All of these are powerful pieces of circumstantial evidence that raise doubt but do not provide a direct confession. A skeptic could try to dismiss any of them as a mistake, a strange coincidence, or a misinterpretation. But now we have reached the final stage of our investigation, a document that cannot be refuted. This is not an interpretation, but a direct quote. It is an authentic letter written by the hand of Napoleon Bonaparte and addressed to Emperor Alexander I. It is kept in the archive and published in the Yeltsin Presidential Library, which eliminates any doubt about its authenticity. Picture the scene. September 1812. Napoleon is in Moscow, but this is not the triumph of a conqueror. The ancient capital is in flames, set on fire, as he believes, on the orders of Governor-General Rostopchin. The Grand Army is trapped in a giant snare without provisions or winter quarters. At this most dramatic moment, in the midst of the ashes, Napoleon takes up his pen and writes a letter to Alexander, whom the whole world considers his sworn enemy. And the tone of this letter is striking. From the very first lines, he addresses him not as a victor to the vanquished, but as an equal, my lord, my brother. He writes that he started the war without animosity, and that a single note from Alexander after the last battle could have stopped his advance. This already sounds extremely unusual for warring monarchs. But then comes a phrase that, with a single stroke of the pen, brings the entire house of cards of official history crashing down. Napoleon writes, "And I would have actually been willing to sacrifice to you the advantage of entering Moscow first." Let's reread the sentence slowly and ponder every word. Sacrifice to you the advantage. Enemies do not sacrifice advantages to each other. They seize them from each other in bloody battles. Entering Moscow first. The capture of an enemy's capital is the highest point of any military campaign, the pinnacle of triumph, a symbol of complete and final victory. And Napoleon, the greatest military commander of his era, writes that he was ready to concede this greatest honor to his enemy. How was that even possible? Such a phrase, such a concession, could only have been made in one single case. If Napoleon and Alexander were on the same side, if they were not enemies, but allies carrying out a common task. In this scenario, everything falls into place. This letter is the key that unlocks all the locks we have encountered before. Now, it becomes clear why the anniversary medal bore the motto, "In unity there is strength." It was not about reconciliation, but about their initial alliance. The meaning of the gift, the saber to General Shuvalov, becomes clear. It was not a tribute of respect to a jailer, but a gesture of gratitude to a comrade in arms for his help. The development of a common military uniform also finds a logical explanation. Their armies were supposed to act in concert, like a single mechanism. And of course, now we understand why the single-headed Napoleonic eagle stands on Russian monuments all over the country. It was not the symbol of an enemy, but the common standard of their united Grand European Army operating under a single flag. Napoleon's letter is a direct confession. It ties all the clues together and proves that the official version of the War of 1812 is a grandiose falsification. But in uncovering one mystery, we encounter another even larger one. If Alexander and Napoleon were allies, then who were they fighting against? Who was that real powerful enemy that occupied Moscow and the lands up to the Urals? That very mysterious Muscovy or Tartary that the French emperor wrote about in his reports, who was so strong that it took the combined might of all of Europe and the Russian Empire to defeat them. It seems the real history of those events is just beginning. So, the familiar and clear picture of the War of 1812, learned from school, has crumbled under the weight of evidence that is impossible to ignore. We started small with one strange medal where sworn enemies are depicted as allies under the motto, "In unity there is strength." But this small crack in the monolith of official history quickly grew as other silent witnesses began to speak. We saw a whole series of award badges where Napoleon was honored in Russia as a hero. We touched his personal saber given to a Russian general not as a trophy, but as a sign of the deepest respect and gratitude. We learned that the emperors worked together on the design of military uniforms as if preparing their armies not for battle against each other, but for a joint parade. And finally, we saw this hidden code immortalized in stone throughout the country. Dozens of monuments dedicated to the Russian victory are crowned with Napoleon's personal symbol, the single-headed imperial eagle. When all these details come together, they cease to be coincidences. They become irrefutable proof. And Napoleon's letter from Moscow, in which he offers to cede to Alexander the honor of entering the capital first, transforms from a puzzle into a directed mission. It confirms they were not enemies. They were partners in a grand game, the true rules of which have been hidden from us. If we put all the pieces of this puzzle together, a completely different alternative picture of events emerges. The War of 1812 was not an invasion of Russia by France. It seems to have been a large-scale joint campaign, a military operation of a united European army under common command, directed against another common enemy, against that very mysterious power that Napoleon in his documents called Muscovy or Tartary. Perhaps it was a state that controlled vast territories from central Russia to the Urals, a remnant of some ancient empire. Remember the map on the monument in Smolensk, where the eastern border of Russia runs along the Ural Mountains? This is not a cartographer's mistake. It was likely the real goal of the campaign to return these lands to the control of Alexander's empire, but with the forces of a pan-European coalition. In this version of history, Napoleon acts not as an aggressor, but as an ally who helped the Romanovs crush a powerful internal enemy and expand their power to the east. And the burning of Moscow was not an act of vandalism by the French, but a desperate move by that other losing side, trying to destroy the capital so that it would not fall to the victors. Later, when the world changed, it became more advantageous to rewrite this complex and ambiguous history to create a simple and understandable myth of a great patriotic war, a heroic struggle against a foreign invader. This myth was more convenient for fostering patriotism and strengthening national unity. The true story of a great civil war, in which all of Europe participated, was securely hidden in the archives, while its symbols were left standing in plain sight as a mockery of our ignorance. Now the choice is yours. You can continue to believe in the convenient and simple version from the textbook, or you can accept the fact that history is not a static dogma, but a most complex detective story, full of mysteries and unsolved cases. The artifacts we have examined are not fiction. They are real, and they force us to ask questions, to doubt, and to seek our own answers. Do not take anything on faith. Think for yourself. After all, the true history is the one you discover for yourself.